What? No. You got overflow back.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending day 2 of our Public Safety Symposium. This session is Resolving Cold Cases with Multi-Layered Resources, presented by Melissa Morley, Dr. Christina Lane, and Dr. Chris Kunkel. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to them.
All right, am I? Yes, I am. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Melissa Morley. I am a commander in the Albany Police Department. I am actually the commander of our OPS office, which is our internal affairs. This is not an internal affairs speech, so you guys are in the right place. This is a cold case, kind of a case study that we've been working on. I got my hand into cold cases as a detective. I was in the forensic investigation unit in 2018, and that is kind of how I started down this road, and it just followed me throughout my career path. Back in 2018, I met Dr. Lane, Dr. Kunkel, and we formed this partnership that we cannot shake. And we're just going to talk, we're going to focus on one case today. It's a homicide investigation from 1964. We'll get into the details a little bit, but I'm going to let these two introduce themselves. Go ahead. Oh, okay. All right. Well, then I'm going to go forward. We are going to start with our particulars of the case. On Monday, September 14th, 1964, 8:17 a.m., the Albany Police Department received a call. The call came in as a request for an ambulance. We responded to 117 Colony Street, and we found the deceased body of our victim. Our victim's name is Catherine Blackburn. It was very obvious based on the wounds that this was a suspicious death, and officers were requested to arrive. She was found in her residence at 117 Colony Street, which is no longer standing. It was a two-family residence, first floor, second floor, and she was found on the second floor. The second floor was a vacant flat. It was unfurnished. She was in the process of renting this out to potential tenants, and she was found splayed out in the living room. As soon as you opened the door to the flat, she was right there, and she had extensive injuries. Her family was on scene. She was discovered by her niece, Sandy, and when they received a call from her co-workers Monday morning because she didn't show up for work. Something about our victim, and I don't want to get too much into victimology because that's later in the presentation, but she was a creature of habit. She had her routines, and she was very reliable, and so when she didn't show up to work Monday, that raised a lot of suspicions. Her family was called from her coworkers, and that's what prompted her family to respond to her apartment. They were interviewed extensively. Canvassing was done extensively. This was a very heavy investment for the police department back in 1964, and because this was a very gruesome crime. Like I said, she had extensive injuries that we'll get into further later on in the presentation, but there was a lot of manpower exhausted in this investigation. This was followed up on for years after, and the case eventually grew cold. Going through her last steps, Saturday, September 12th. So the date of discovery of her body was Monday, September 14th. And we're estimating that her day of death was Saturday, September 12th. The original estimation for the date of death was placed on the 13th. But through further investigation, it's been changed to the 12th. So her last timeline we have on Saturday the 12th at noon. The victim worked all week as normal, and she left work at noon on Friday for the weekend. She had a ride home from a friend. At 3:30 in the afternoon, took out the names of the neighbor one, didn't see anything unusual. She didn't report seeing anything out of the ordinary. And between 4 and 5 p.m., there was a paper delivery. The newspaper, the paper boy delivered the newspaper between 4 and 5, handed the paper to her, had contact with her victim, and told her that he would collect on Monday. Very normal interaction. At 6 p.m., neighbor 2 saw our victim sweeping her sidewalk, and again, very normal. She was in good spirits. 9:30 p.m. is our first time that we have something out of the ordinary reported. Neighbor 3 noted that our victim normally slept with a bright light on, but this night at 9:30, the light was still not on at this time. So obviously we can narrow down between 6 and 9:30 p.m. is our time of incident. 10:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., our victim's boyfriend, who lives in a separate apartment, they did not live together, called to catch up with her and had no answer, and we didn't think anything of it at the time. On the 13th, so early Sunday morning, the 13th, 3:10 a.m., neighbor 4 saw a light on in the victim's home when she was coming home from work. 5:30, neighbor 2 noted that when she woke up, the victim did not have on the light she normally slept with on. And again, this is significant because our victim was such a creature of habit. Her activities were known and she had them planned out. Normally she was a creature of habit, so all these things are pertinent to our investigation. 6 a.m. Or 8 a.m., the victim always went to Sunday Mass down at a church in the South End, and she was not present for Sunday Mass at either times, and this was extremely unlikely for her. Neighbor 5 was interviewed and noted that he normally saw the victim hanging out her laundry on Sundays after Mass, but he did not see her on this day. So, obviously, again, initially, all the lack of sightings on Sunday helped them initially, but again, through further work, we were able to narrow it down to Saturday. Just a couple of things for the initial investigation that were important that we have given attention to since then. But initially, I mentioned that she was showing her apartment, that second floor she was trying to get rented. She had a receipt book in her apartment on the first floor, and a receipt, I mean, you don't really see them anymore. It's kind of like the same form as like a checkbook. She writes out a receipt and she has stubs left in that book. So she keeps the stubs, she gives the receipt to whoever is putting the down payment. We have a gentleman, or we can say is a prospective tenant, whether or not that is genuine or not, who put down a $10 deposit. He gave the name of Robert Broadhead. That was lifted from the receipt book through indentation analysis that was performed by the FBI back in the 60s. So that was a huge lead at the time. He gave an address on the receipt book of 369 2nd Avenue, and that was followed up extensively. There's a lot of background work done on that. That was a huge lead, especially considering that our victim had mentioned to friends, family members, that she was expecting a tenant. She had somebody come take a look at the apartment. She had mentioned a couple reservations about him, a couple of characteristics, had mentioned that he had been drinking or smelled of alcohol. For whatever reason, he made her feel uneasy. She couldn't exactly articulate what that was, but we've all heard that time and time again. Something's just off, and that's how she described this gentleman. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds there, but this was a huge lead for us, and we still have this evidence book, or I'm sorry, this receipt book in evidence, and we're not necessarily done with this yet. All right. 2018, I mentioned earlier that in 2018 I was a detective in our forensic investigation unit, and I found myself working on cold cases just by chance, truly just by chance. Somebody that I work with had mentioned hearing about this case from a few retirees, just trading stories, and the depravity displayed in this incident. I couldn't believe that I had never heard of the case. I had never heard about it. I didn't know anything about it. I never heard anybody talking about it. I had asked a couple people at the police department who were hired around the 70s if they had heard anything about it, and only a few people did. So I was curious about it, so I wanted to pull our evidence and see if we had anything. And that's how I started. I just pulled our box of physical evidence and started looking through it, and surprisingly, we had a lot of stuff in evidence still, and packaged, you know, not to the standards that we collect and package today, understandably so, but really good work done initially in the 60s. And so I just started by repackaging our evidence and cataloging it into our evidence system to bring it kind of up to our current standards. At that same time, in 2018, as I'm working through this, the niece that I had mentioned, Sandy, who found her aunt deceased, had seen a news story about the college, and reached out to the college, introduced herself and said, you know, my aunt was murdered in 1964 and was wondering if the college could help her in any way, maybe reopen the case and see what they could do. When the college reached out to me, it actually turned out that Sandy and I have a connection. Sandy is my neighbor today. So it's a very weird situation, but the stars aligned, and that is where our relationship came about.
Hello there, I am Dr. Christina Lane. I am the criminologist at Russell Sage College. Now, I was at the College of St. Rose. You may recognize me and the assistant director here of the Criminal Investigation Resource Center. We did a presentation with the Colony Police Department involving Ruth Whitman from 1959, and the exhumation that led to finding DNA to locate her killer. So today we are introducing a new presentation. However, Albany Police Department is our first partnership to start in 2018 when we announced the beginnings of the Cold Case Analysis Center. So as you know, the College of St. Rose is closed now, and Dr. Kunkel and I moved the program, and luckily our partners followed us, and now we are called the Criminal Investigation Resource Center. Another manifestation of the Cold Case Analysis Centers of SUNY Albany, but it's not our method or program that's being utilized. So to give you an idea, briefly, of what CIRC does, is we do not do any real, as you would call, investigating. We don't interview people, we don't talk to anybody. It is purely organizational work. So we are giving, you know, your tubs of files, and we organize everything in a thematic manner so it's easy to find information when detectives or investigators have time to get back to the case. So we engage in many archival researches, getting maps, plotting last steps out, and finding more stuff that will be informative for the detective assigned on the case. We also have experts, as beyond me as a criminologist and Dr. Kunkel as a forensic psychologist. We have forensic entomologists, forensic anthropologists, and also specialists in statement analysis and so on to assist in these cases with permission from the police department. So we add a whole information resource and assistance with these cases, right down to doing genealogical mapping. We have several units within CIRC. I have approximately 34 interns working for us. And by the nature of the homicides that we work on, it does cover many units of sex crimes, also missing persons, because some homicides start as missing. And by the nature inherent by the program, the students do engage in criminal analysis and also continuing education and professional training, which we'll add here to later on. We also do grant writing for police agencies, and Dr. Kunkel also provides behavior assessments, which you'll be privy for today. So one of our experts, as you went through the timeline and you noticed Saturday at 9:30, things went quiet with somebody's very routine-like in a neighborhood that had high cohesion, meaning that we all knew what was going on. So when we have this here, we thought, and the police back then, and of course what the police reports have, okay, this is it. However, when we're looking at the timeline and organized the case, we noticed that all of a sudden her manners changed. You know, she wasn't seen, the lights weren't on. A different light was on. So our expert, forensic anthropologist, Dr. Fabian, she was also crucial in the Colony PD case and the exhumation too, is that she identified by looking at the autopsy photos and actually believed that she was actually killed Saturday evening as opposed to the Sunday morning, which helped building the case and organize the material. And the one element here, it wasn't the livor mortis that actually indicated that. It was actually the rigor mortis, which resolves in 3 to 36 hours. And when she was on the autopsy table, she still had rigor in her legs and indicated that she was probably more likely killed on Saturday evening. So as you already know, you have what everybody says in the case as neighbors and so on, but it's always the science that has to back up and give direction of the investigation. So I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Chris Kunkel, the Associate Director.
Okay, hello everybody. So I get the fun part. I get to talk about all the gory stuff. And some of you are going to say this is really interesting, and others are going to say, how are you talking about this? And want to leave the room. But I'll try and balance it so we don't get to that point. So it's really exciting to be, I need my clicker. It's really exciting to be here and talking about this case. This is 60 years old. A week ago, we passed the 60th anniversary of this case, and we're getting very close to the resolution of this case. We are now 8 years, it seems like, into working with Albany PD on this, and every year we've made progress. Every year that the partnership's been involved, we've made a step towards resolving this, and we're all optimistic that we're going to get there. Some may say we're not, but we're going to do it. So, but that's not totally the goal. All right, the goal when we started the Cold Case Analysis Center, and now we have the Criminal Investigation Resource Center, is to provide this interaction between police and students, to give students learning opportunities, and to provide assistance to police agencies, especially those who are smaller and need our services. We'll get a little bit more into the services as we go on and describe. But one of the things that Albany PD asked for in this case was a behavioral reconstruction. So some of you may think this is a behavioral profile. We'll go back to the old FBI profiling. This is different in a sense. There are elements to profiling to what we do, but also this is a reconstruction of what happened to try to aid the investigation. So when we get to evidence and we get to try to either prosecute or identify who committed this crime, we have a little bit more about their personality, their characteristics, but we also are learning about how the crime actually took place. So we're looking at the method of offending, but we're also looking at the psychological characteristics of the offender at the time. So we're trying to determine how the crime was carried out, but also what might have been the motivators behind it. And when we get down to suspects and we get to identifying people, we're looking for historical traits that might point us in that direction. So with any behavioral analysis, we start with the victim. As Dr. Lane and Melissa were describing, she was very organized. Okay, it's great to go into a crime scene and have an organized victim, so that you have a really good indication of what's out of place. One of the first crime scenes I ever worked, the victim was so organized that we could tell every piece of material that was out of place in her home, and it helped us move backwards to the suspect. It's very similar in this case. She had relatively no risk. She's 50 years old, living alone, had friends, socialized, went to church, had a job, living a pretty standard lifestyle. Her neighborhood was busy. There were lots of people living there. You saw that there were neighbors who noticed when her lights weren't on, when things were different. All right, so everybody knew she was organized and the neighborhood was busy. What she did, what does change in her risk profile, and this is something we look at, is that she rented and she had rented before, but she had recently rented and run an advertisement in the newspaper that she had a room for rent. And when she entertained new tenants who came to look at the apartment, she exposed herself to risk. We do this today on Zillow. Okay, so all of your homes, pretty much, if I know your address, I can pretty much see the layout of your house, which is really terrifying. But the reality is that back in 1964, he didn't have that vision into her house, and he was able to enter the house. And we're strongly believing that her perpetrator is this prospective tenant, the person who had the receipt, because that receipt was torn from the book and taken from the property after the crime was committed. And he would have had no reason, no one else would have had any reason to take that receipt. We're not even sure why he took it, because we're not certain that he gave the real name. But nonetheless, it points in his direction as the perpetrator. All right. We also know that she was estranged from her husband, or her husband was living out of the country at the time, and there's no reason to suspect. All right, so let's get into the profile. We're actually just a few blocks from where her home was, here in downtown Albany. She was just to the north, east of here. And her house sat at the corner of Colony and, is it Gould Street? Right? So the actual, you're seeing the house, this is Gould Street, okay? So we believe that when the perpetrator exited, the basement door is actually under that porch, okay? It's one of these center hall buildings, and that the basement door comes right out from under the white part of the porch there, immediately under the front door, what is considered the front door. So that door was unlocked. That's actually how her niece got into the house when she went in to see what was going on and why she wasn't responding to phone calls and knocking. And that door was unlocked. So it's believed that every other door and window was locked. So it's believed that when he exited the property, he exited that way. Here's the advertisement, obviously exposing her to the risks in the neighborhood. And then we get to the new tenant. So we talked about this a little bit to start, but so the tenant came to see the apartment. She was leery of the tenant. She made comments to her boyfriend, Ben. She described him as a white male. Well, he described what she described to him to police. So when they questioned Ben, this is what he said. He said, she described him as a white male, small and slight, middle-aged, wiry, and he smelled of alcohol, and that'll come into the profile in a minute. That him and his mother were looking for an apartment, and they needed to move. Now, she thought this was strange because the address he gave, 369 2nd Avenue, which is down Delaware, towards the south, and towards Glenmont, right? In that direction, that was a better neighborhood than where she was living, and she wondered why someone would want to live there. So her and Ben actually went down to check out the neighborhood, couldn't identify the address, and then they just went back home. So clearly something was off about this man, and she cued in on it. And she probably should have had somebody with her when he came back, but nonetheless, that instinct didn't kick in. She also told a neighbor that he lived in Connecticut with his mother, and that him and his mother needed to rent the place. So there were multiple stories that were going around it, and we all know that these stories sometimes have their little inaccuracies. And he also asked about the cellar, and he asked to see the basement while he was in the house. So that was interesting. It probably was because he was casing out the house and looking for entry and exit points. So we know from this, and I'll give little tidbits of the profile as we go along, we know he was a planner. We know because of entering the house and meeting with her beforehand, he was setting up the offense. This is a person who plans things, he's organized. This wasn't an impulsive act. He knew when he was going to come back. He knew when he was going to attempt to perpetrate this crime. He may have abandoned it at that point because things didn't work right, but he knew that on Saturday evening that he was going to perpetrate this crime. So everybody, we have two sources, her sister and her boyfriend had stated that the tenant was supposed to come back Saturday night. That was September 12th. That's about the time of death. Okay, so this is a sketch of her apartment from early on in the investigation. Nice little sketch that officers did when they were sketching it out. Also another But as we start to look at some of the crime scene photos, you can see they drew the trail of blood from the one room to the next, and that place where her body ends up is a pretty significant point to both the profile and the acts that happened after her death. And then just another, you can see the front lawn, actually the porch is on Gould Street, the front lawn is on Colony Street, so that, and then that her front bedroom would have been up in the front on the lower part of the screen here. That's the upstairs bedroom where she was initially killed and then dragged right to the top of those stairs, and that's really important to what happened next. Okay, so what happened? All right, so we purposefully do not have any pictures of the body. Okay, this is a grotesque homicide. It involves post-mortem mutilation. This was a terrible act. All right, but we can describe what happened, and we'll describe how that's important to how the behavior assessment works out. All right, so we know from the autopsy that she had injuries to her fingers, and we know from the autopsy that she had blunt force trauma to the back of her head. That blunt force trauma to the back of the head was a square-edged instrument. All right, the initial thought was from police back in the 60s, it's a hammer. Well, they're not far off. It's blunt force, it's swung easily and fast, and it causes trauma to the skull. But that square edge is not typical of most hammers. So we start investigating when we get this case back in 2018. We start talking about what might this instrument be, what might it speak to as far as suspects go. One of the first tools that came to mind was a meat tenderizer, a meat mallet. They're square-edged, all right, they're easy to swing. Now through some other research and some other thoughts about other evidence we'll get to in a second, we believe it may have been a different type of hammer. It's actually a metal forging hammer. These old forging hammers had a square face. They were just as light. You use them to pound down metal when it's heated, when you're forging knives or doing blacksmithing. Okay, that'll become important in a second. So we believe the first action is she's struck from behind multiple times with a blunt force object. That renders her either dead or unconscious. Okay, and then she's turned over or ends up on her back, and she's stabbed twice in the throat. One hits her carotid artery, and that's what causes this blood loss and death. All right, so she's hit on both sides. So when we look back into who uses that method, right? This is when we get into the behavioral analysis. Who uses that method to kill? All right, farmers do. Farmers, a way to slaughter an animal, particularly pigs, on a farm is to bludgeon them from behind, roll them over, and stick them in the neck. So that speaks to his background, potential knowledge of how he could cause death, and how he could do this quickly. All right. We do not think, at least I don't think, and we've looked at the case for years, that this person likely killed before this day. He may have, he may not have, but when you look at the probabilities and how things went down, this may have been his first act. And that comes next. All right. There's a massive blood loss, you can see it. Okay. He immediately goes looking for something to soak this up. So he finds sheets in the house downstairs, because the upstairs is vacant. So this is the upstairs vacant apartment where this happens. So it's believed that she was taking him through the upstairs apartment. When they entered this doorway between the kitchen and the side bedroom, that he bludgeoned her from behind and stabbed her. So now he makes an attempt with a sheet, like a drop cloth, to clean up the blood. But that's not enough. She's bleeding from the head, which bleeds immensely in blunt force trauma, and then she's also stabbed in the throat and hits the carotid artery, which causes massive blood loss. So in the time that it takes him to go downstairs to get sheets, and he grabs a couple of pillows, which you'll see in a minute, there's massive blood loss to the point that it starts seeping through the floor. Okay, this is an old house. This is 1964. This house was probably built in the late 1800s. It's downtown Albany. This house is gone. It's been gone for years. So he needs to now move the body from this point so he can do what he actually planned to do. All right, so you can see the drag marks as he pulls her around the corner and out into that center room. There's another picture of those drag marks. You can see her shoes. So these shoes would have been as they entered that room. So it's interesting that they either were kicked off, pulled off by him and thrown over there, or they came off during the attack. Likely the first scenario. And then there's two pillows right there. You can see them against that cabinet. And here's a close-up of them. All right, so I'll jump forward just a little bit, and Tina's going to talk about, I think, this part. We ended up doing DNA analysis on some items, and these pillows were two of those items. We used an instrument called MVAC, and we'll get into that. But these pillows yielded no profile, no identifiable profile. So we were hoping they would. There was some blood and a handprint there, but the mixture of the victim's blood was so highly concentrated that there was no way to pull out whatever DNA might have been left from the hand in the print. But luckily, there's other evidence. We do end up with a handkerchief that was touched by the perpetrator, believed to be touched by the perpetrator, and left by the victim. Okay, and that's important because he drags her across. You can see the tile-like floor. That's the kitchen area, and then he pulls her out into the center room of the upstairs. So you would walk up the stairs, there'd be a big center room, and all the other rooms are off of it. And then she's laid to rest there at the top of the stairs. And you can see there's still a decent amount of blood loss, but where the streaks are is where she was dragged across, and then her head is left at that ring. So her feet are then facing the clean part where you can see the shoe of the officer in the photo. All right. So this is where all the really horrible stuff after death happened. This perpetrator went downstairs. There was no heater, no gas or electricity in the upstairs apartment operating. He went downstairs and he heated knives in the burners of the stove in the downstairs, and he carried them one by one upstairs and mutilated her breast and lips by burning, by contact burning. Okay, so one of the things that comes out in the profile is who heats metal in flames. Farmers, blacksmiths, right? They shape metal, okay? They make things. Sometimes hunters, sometimes bow hunters, right? They make arrows, they make arrowheads, they make knives, all kinds, they make horseshoes, right? So the act of heating metal, he knows, will heat up the knives to the point of causing branding or burning, and he takes the knives up and he creates two symmetrical circles on each breast, one burn by one burn at a time. This takes a long time. So we did, with the students and the anthropologists, a test study with banana peels to see how long it would take to make each line and make it symmetrical. It was a long time. So this man spent a great deal of time with the victim. So that speaks to his compulsion. So what this is in deviant speak is necrosadism. All right. So this person needed to cause the death of the victim to enact his fantasy, but his fantasies are sadistic. He can't do those sadistic acts with a living victim. It's part of his psychology. He wants to fantasize about being sadistic, hurting the victim, and being dominant, but he can only do that with a dead victim. So he's engaging in sadistic acts by burning a body, which would cause screaming and horror, on someone who's already dead. And he's fantasizing about what that's doing. So a person like this has lived in fantasy for years. All right, we know this from the research. We didn't know this in 1964. All right, there's a lot we've learned about sexual deviance throughout the last 60 years that wasn't available at the time this crime was committed. All right, because we've started to capture these people and talk to them and learn about them and learn about their lives. So he would have engaged in what we call proxy acts. All right, so these are acts where the person fantasizes about what's occurring. Many of these types of offenders are voyeurs, peepers. They expose themselves. They do things that are very passive in the offense realm, but they're fantasizing about being more aggressive and being more dominant. All right, so in this instance, he found a victim and he acted on it. I just want to make sure I'm covering all that part. So what we were able to deduce is, this is a person who was obviously, by his own statements, living alone, all right, and saying he was moving in with his mother. He may have lived with a mother. He may not have. He certainly was a planner and organized. The victim described him as smelling of alcohol. If he was smelling of alcohol at the time that he came to visit her to look at the apartment, he's likely using alcohol to facilitate crime. So this is somebody who would get slightly intoxicated, so he would dampen his inhibitions, and that would allow him to get closer to victims. So it's somebody who uses substances to actually engage in crimes, but he's probably not an alcoholic. It's just a facilitator, and we see this in a lot of sex offenders. They actually use alcohol just as a loosening of the inhibitions. Now, like I said, he probably committed lower level sex offenses leading up to this offense. We took that profile and started searching for other crimes, and we're continuing to do that to see if we can find a pattern. We already talked about the basement door and the stairs leading out. So these just so this is when you enter the basement. This is the staircase that leads up under the door. So this would have been the exit point. And he would have been able to access the basement from the upstairs and then go out the other door.
All right, so based on the title is using multi-layered resources. So now you can see that we utilize interns, we utilize forensic anthropologists, we also utilize the associate director, the forensic psychologist that does have trial and expert testimony experience to do the behavior assessment. And luckily, we actually became privy of the American Investigation Society of cold cases. They're no longer around. But in spring 2019, at the College of St. Rose, we coordinated a cold case conference. And with this conference, if we presented the crime scene of the Blackburn case, we would actually get funding for advanced forensic technology. So Commander Maury and I, we put together a PowerPoint presentation, and because we just got the case, in one evening, we had the students go through 1,000 pages and make outlines so we can actually construct the PowerPoint presentation rather quickly. So through this here, utilizing ISOC, we actually were able to get funding for the MVAC. So what we had is through ISOC, we had access through Pure Gold Forensics, and we sent pieces of physical evidence. Commander Maury, can you explain a little bit more about what you sent out to Pure Gold?
What we sent out for them was the knife handles. Well, one of the knife handles that Dr. Kunkel mentioned that was used for the post-mortem burning. The handles, there were several knives, and one or two of them were wooden handles. We actually took the handle itself and sent that out for the MVAC testing. Do you want to get into how it works, or? Okay, so the MVAC, you don't see, I think there's an agency in New York State that does have the MVAC technology. It's much more prevalent out west, like I said, Pure Gold's in California, but it's essentially like a wet, has anybody used it, or okay, so it's like a wet vacuum system, and then you actually get your DNA collection from the filter that's in the vacuum itself. So when you have something, I know that there was a case, it was used in the picture, I'm assuming that's a rock, I think that's what it looks like. Touch DNA, it works really, really well for it.
It's really good on substances, so materials, cloths, and that was some of the other items that were sent, a handkerchief or a piece of cloth that was believed to be a handkerchief and sheets.
And to add, because of the system of the MVAC, it is excellent for degraded DNA, especially with the cold case this old. And the very interesting part, when we did this and sent it out, we actually were able to get DNA. But while we sent out the physical evidence, Commander Moore and I tried a podcast. So it was a way during the time, the podcast, I think it was the fall of 2019. There was information, if you do a podcast, get the information out there, you might get some leads to stimulate the community and say, hey, I lived in that area, I want to talk some more about it. So we developed a partnership with iHeartRadio, and unfortunately we didn't stimulate any leads at all. People were more interested into such a sadistic act that we just presented to you, more than just trying to assist the investigation. So unfortunately, what we wanted did not happen, but it was an experience on its own. The next thing is, during that time frame, and I think we did this for about a year and a half. So before I talk about the microfiche researching, as you know, we have VICAP and CODIS. Okay, well, they were developed in 1985 and 1989. Well, this case is 1964. So for us to find any similar crimes, as I said, we only do research and archival research. I sent the students to the library here, and they were introduced to microfiche. And they're like, what is that? Well, you're going to find out. So they looked at the various newspapers, Times Unions, Knickerbocker, everything they could possibly get a hold on, and they looked over microfiche of 25-year-old span. So they started around 1960 to forward, and see if they could find any similar crimes. We anticipated that it would take just a little while, but to our surprise, after a month of the students taking turns in doing this, we found a similar case. And this was a presentation of an older lady, as you can see here in Albany, 84-year-old lady, and she was found murdered, stabbed in her apartment. And so we contacted Commander Maury, and also back then was Lieutenant Al Martin, and they went and pulled the file. We were very excited that the file was there. Like, woohoo, got the file. Okay, so we got the file, and Lieutenant Martin and Commander Maury were very shocked to see when they saw the crime scene photos that the victim was posed. Almost similar to Blackburn, almost. So we thought, well, this is something to look into. There was some really interesting elements to it in the newspaper. The individual that called it in, he was a 20-year-old man who said that he went to the 84-year-old's apartment to look at pictures of cats. And I'm like, whoa, okay, what 20-year-old would be interested in looking at pictures of cats to the 84-year-old? So we looked at his criminal history, and he had quite the jaded history. And we said, well, this guy's very suspicious. And back then, and the way crimes are, where people are charged, they're charged, but then it doesn't really follow through. We also found like attempted kidnapping. He had a whole assortment of history. Do you want to add anything more?
Yeah, sure. So we, through the students' hard work in the library basements, we came up with this possible connection. And on the surface, we were very excited about it. On the surface, when you look at the pictures, you're like, okay, we're done. This case solved. This gentleman, the cat friend there, he admitted in the initial investigation, he actually had a charge of petty larceny attached to this case number. So that also generated some more excitement for us. Turns out that he may have looked at a picture of a cat, but that was not why he was there. He was there to steal from her. He admitted to stealing some money.
It was $1.75.
Yeah, but said that she had been deceased when he entered her apartment. So long story short, through going through the case file, exploring his criminal history, realizing he did have an extensive criminal history that included some sex crimes in the 80s, we looked to get a DNA swab from him. He was deceased at the time that we made this discovery, so we turned to his family. And his family was extremely cooperative. This is somebody, they had a great relationship with him. They had knew nothing about his criminal history. And that is something that if you are going to be exploring, tackling some cold cases, then I'll touch on this when we close, but your relationships are everything. And a lot of these familial DNA samples that you're gonna have to collect, because you know, in a lot of instances, your offenders will be deceased. It's all voluntary. You know, people do not need, unless you know, have something extenuating, you know, people are not compelled. They don't need to help you. You will find that most people do want to. You know, if you are upfront and honest with them and sensitive to the position that it puts them in, I have found, you know, throughout all of our contacts with family members, they do, you know, generally want to help the police department, and this family was no exception. They were great to work with. Like I said at our first introduction, they were not aware of their relative's criminal history. I did not share that with them. You know, I was honest with them about what we were looking at, and then after they did some research on their own, they came to me after they provided the DNA sample with questions about his public records and that, and I did share with them. You know, I was honest and answered their questions honestly and explained to them why I didn't front load that information to them. And they were, like I said, they were great to work with. DNA came back, it was not a match. So we could cross that gentleman off our list and cross the Reynolds case off as a very strange coincidence, I guess, but not related. So moving into something that did help us out, did you want to touch on this at all? No, okay. So we kind of talked about a bunch of things that we've tried, and it's a labor of love. You're going to have a lot of like swing and misses. So a couple things we tried that didn't work. Something that we did have success with, and this was our holy grail piece of evidence that we went with for our DNA testing that we are using for our genealogy, is a handkerchief. This handkerchief was located underneath the body of our victim, blood soaked, and you know, one of the things that we have to think about when we're going back to 1964 is when you think about like evidence preservation from the 60s. What was DNA back then? Nothing that I knew what he was talking about. That wasn't even, you know, in their headspace at all. But they were aware of blood typing, and they knew that, you know, they didn't want to get in contact with a victim's blood. So that the fact that that was soaked in blood, I was hopeful that touch DNA contamination maybe throughout the decades would be kept to a minimum. Also with that, we're hopeful, we talked about earlier that our victim was a creature of habit. She was very clean, she was very organized. Everything, I mean, the crime scene pictures of her actual apartment, it looks like a Good Housekeeping magazine. This woman was very neat and clean. So we were confident that it would have been a clean handkerchief that she had on her, wouldn't have any contamination from uses prior, so we went with this. Is that? Okay, yep.
And we did get a hit male DNA on this handkerchief, which we'll tell you more in a couple slides. But before we do, Commander Maury did already talk about ruling out the crime suspect that we talked earlier with Julia Reynolds, the 84-year-old woman. So we have that, but then we had other people that we had to rule out. So Commander Maury collected the swabs of, the students were able to locate the individual using various apps, but we located the one person was the boyfriend's, was it cousin, son? The boyfriend's son that you saw? Son. The boyfriend swapped, and he was ruled out, so that wasn't a match. And then we had the taxi cab driver. Now, we identified the taxi cab driver because he's one of those guys who kind of interjected himself in the investigation. It wasn't, of course, a questioning. He was approached. He just said, oh, I met her, and it was very strange that he drove her somewhere and she got in a weird argument about sheets. And so we kind of thought that this guy, as opposed to deflecting attention, got attention in the case because of his behavior and what he had to say. But through the process of swabbing relatives of these three, no hits, which is great because we are ruling people on the investigation. But the one element, going back to the handkerchief and the presentation of the crime scene, we strongly believe, I think I can contend, okay, all of us, is that this is a stranger that's involved in the homicide. So this supports in what we are deducting in the behavior assessment of the crime scene. So now we're coming to play with the FBI. So Melissa, if you could continue talking about getting access to the FBI and their program.
Okay, so I touched on earlier when you are in a situation where you want to collect DNA swabs for reference from family members in the hopes of using it for genealogical research purposes. There are a lot of steps and how-tos, and I have contact information on there for anybody who wants to kind of need some guidance for this part. Just something that you do need to keep in your mind as you're evaluating any physical evidence, any DNA evidence that you have available for testing. What you need to do genealogy is SNP DNA, single nucleotide polymorphism DNA is what the genealogical sites use as opposed to regular YSTR DNA typing. And let's see, yep, so, what give a genealogical value? Yes, so that's what our genealogical sites use. It's essentially just a mutation on the DNA, and the mutation markers are what the SNP profile is testing. That is used by genealogical sites because it retains its structure very well over a prolonged period of time, and you see mutations throughout generations. That is the typing that is required to use. So if you have a DNA profile ready to roll, you're going to have to make sure that you have the SNP ready to go as well. And that is the Seasons of Justice the next slide? Okay. And I'm going to touch on that because, as we all know, it's all fun and games until someone has to pay for it. So.
Exactly. So we got in contact through the FBI case manager, and they did approve to do the genetic genealogy, but they said you've got to find funding for the SNP. So we're like, oh, that's going to take something. Okay, so we found the Seasons of Justice. So we found the funding opportunity. The Seasons of Justice, which I'm sure most of you might be familiar with, and what they do is they actually provide funds to bring resolution to those impacted by unsolved violent crimes, and particularly DNA analysis solutions. So what I did is I wrote up the grant for Albany PD, and we submitted the grant for funds, and we actually were covering ourselves. It was for genealogy and SNP, just in case things fell through. And so through ISOC, we got about $8,000 to $9,000 for the initial forensic technology, and at the Seasons of Justice, they gave us approximately $11,000. So through the many different resources and access and networking, we actually got to the level of close to $20,000 for this Blackburn case. So through the Seasons of Justice, the next step here was Orthram.
You go ahead.
Okay. All right, so what we have with Orthram, because the FBI said that they wanted to do the genetic genealogy, it gave being in New York State more options. Because we know, or you might not know, Paragon and Bodie are approved by New York State, but not Orthram. But since we are going through the FBI, we were able to go to Orthram that doesn't have as much long waiting times. So the FBI came by the Albany Police Department, collected the evidence, and brought it to Orthram, and then they continued with the rest of the genealogy analysis. And you can see here, which was great, Orthram also agreed that the DNA extract from the handkerchief was viable and enough to continue with the analysis. if we can continue on.
All right, we're gonna roll through this here. So, like I said, or like Dr. Lane said, we are currently exploring genealogy with the help of the FBI. And once they have identified a relative, they input this through the genealogical sites. The students are also very helpful, helping build off of that as well. When we see ourselves going down one direction, and again, if you get a hit with DNA, your work is not done. When you're doing forensic genealogy, that is kind of when your work is just beginning. There is still a lot of research to be done. We talked earlier about the students going through microfiche and visiting the libraries and doing extensive research. They are also able to do that sourcing social media sites and current news articles and public records. That's stuff that they're always working on anytime we get a new lead with anything. And the genealogy is just another lead that we use that they can seize on. We were talking about sort of that's sharks chumming the water. That's kind of how the students are. When you give them something, they get right on there. They do a great job. Go ahead.
And so we have an archive expert that she goes ahead and she does the mapping, and then when we identify individuals, we send the interns to the library. And the nice thing in 1964, there's directories and tells you where they worked and so on. And based on the blacksmithing and the working with metal, actually gives us further insight based on the behavior assessment. So right now we're going through and identifying familiar lines and ruling out lineages based on the handkerchief. And go.
Okay. This is my contact who I've been working with, Special Agent Lori Giordano, the FBI. She's out of the New York office. I spoke with her the other day, and she said anybody who is looking to get started, they have a case that they're working on or interested in using forensic genealogy for, feel free to reach out to her. Her email is up there. And she is great to work with. Lori has a lot of experience. She has been doing genealogy for years, and she is a great resource. She's very easy to work with if you have questions, or if you want to get her participation and get something concrete started. She's great. So I can't say enough good things about her and the work that she's done, and her accessibility is fantastic. I know we're running out of time. To close quick, this is a case, again, a gruesome homicide from 1964. With cold cases, it's tough to prioritize them now because I know everybody is doing more with less. Everybody is. And we have victims of today that need our attention. However, this is a case from 1960. It's hard to put our minds there. Most of us here, I'm sure, weren't even around then, so it's easy to put that in the rearview mirror. The woman, the niece who found her aunt brutally murdered in 1964 is still here, and she's still very affected by this case. She has to take a vacation every year when the anniversary comes up because of how affected she is by it. So it is important to stay the course and do everything that we can do. We're not going to be able to solve every single crime. There are reasons why certain ones don't get solved or they don't have the closure that we hope for, but we have to at least try and reevaluate things that we have at our disposal now. We didn't have the resources or the technology in 1964 that we have today, and this case being solved was not for a lack of trying. It was not for a lack of great police work back in the 60s, but we have different standards, different technology, different opportunities, and we should be reevaluating all these cases as time allows. The center has been a fantastic partner. I can't say enough about Dr. Lane's professionalism and her appreciation for confidentiality. I know that is something that gives everybody cause for pause. These are, if they're cold cases, they're active criminal investigations regardless on if they have movement or not. That being said, they are cold cases for a reason, and you have to kind of think outside the box. So my suggestion is anybody who has something that they want to get involved in, they have a cold case that they're thinking about right now, or they're thinking, how do I get started on even looking at our department's cold cases? Your contacts and your relationships are everything, and it is very much a team effort. reach out to me, reach out to Dr. Lane. Our contact information is up there. You know, like I said, the center with Dr. Lane, confidentiality is everything. She has shown time and time again that she takes it seriously. The students, you know, are willing to go through background checks, they sign on disclosures. That's up to you and your department to figure out with the center and Dr. Lane. They're very responsive. And you can come up with a situation, you know, tailor it to what works for your department and what works for you. Like I said, your relationships are everything. You gotta think outside the box a little bit and don't hesitate to ask for help. We've been doing this for 6 years and I've been on the phone so many people. God bless the State Police Lab. I don't know if anybody here is from the State Police Lab, but they are fantastic to work with as well, and have answered a lot of questions. All I can say is that if you have somebody in your department that's looking to get involved, just kind of let them do the thing, because you don't know what you can come up with, and there are a lot of opportunities.